What's up, guys? Drew here. Thanks so much for stopping by and checking out this episode of The Hedge, where Brad and I sit down with Adam Leslie, CEO at Levenhall. Now, in this episode, we cover everything from how technology enables total situational awareness to how governments go about conducting security operations in the midst of a pandemic and everything in between. Now, you know me, and I do have a few foil hats in the closet, and in this episode, they come out just a little bit. It's not too bad. Hey, you'll make it. I promise. Now, if you haven't already, don't forget to go and like, subscribe, and sign up for notifications for the channel so that you don't miss out on any of the future content that we drop here. Now, speaking of future content, if you haven't done so already, please go down in the comment section and leave us a note in terms of what you'd like to see, people you'd like us to interview, things that you'd like us to talk about, just random things that you might want us to address here on the channel. That way we can make sure that we're delivering the type of content that you, our viewer and listeners, really want to see. So, with that being said, let's jump in to the interview. Welcome, everybody, to The Edge, a TMGcore production. I'm Drew Null.
And I'm Brad Furnish.
And today we have a very special guest with us. Mr. Adam Leslie is an experienced former Australian national security professional, Army officer, and currently CEO of Levenhall. Levenhall is a commercial intelligence advisory company based in Silicon Valley, California. At Levenhall, Adam leads a team of former intelligence and defense professionals to seek out unconventional and disruptive national security-related technology. Levenhall advises these companies on investment options, structural design, and expansion through global business development. They also work with VCs in the USA and overseas to bring national security-related deal flow and to mentor their portfolio companies for intelligence use cases. So, Adam, thanks so much for your time and for being on with us today.
My pleasure.
Awesome. So, Adam, one of the things that we ask all of our guests as a bit of an icebreaker when they come on is if you could briefly share with our listeners the most unexpected turn in your career, and that could either be, a positive turn, an unexpected thing that happened in your career, or something that we would maybe consider more of a character building moment, if you will. And it doesn't have to be a really long drawn out thing, just a little nugget for our listeners to kind of learn a little bit more about you.
Yeah, of course. No, that's a good one. And there's plenty of them. You have turns and twists in your career and your life that shape you. And, I've been doing this for a little while now. Let me just think. The most recent significant one is a personal one tied to a career one. So I finished off my career with the Australian government in Dubai. I was posted to Dubai and I was in charge of what we call the Office of Regional Affairs, which had essentially a look on Africa. And, we're working a whole bunch of different issues. But while I was there, I met and then married an American girl who was working in the CIA at the time, and essentially our postings didn't match. So she ended up leaving the agency to stay with me. Then she got a job in Silicon Valley in Tesla, so I, which I think was a fair quid pro quo, decided that it would be a good thing to follow my heart and ended up in Silicon Valley. And that really was the start of the sort of major pivot in my life, which led me down this innovation path. Because I built a business here with some former agency colleagues, former Marine. I've got a fellow in Australia who was a classmate of mine who was an Army officer and a diplomat also. And it was being in Silicon Valley and seeing the technology that's here and the innovation culture that is here in the US, which is very different from Australia, very different from anywhere else I've experienced. And seeing that technology and saying and thinking, and all of us actually as a team thinking, we need this technology in our former professions. We need to be able to find ways to get it from where it sits to where it needs to be.
That's cool.
So that was it's been a massive change, but a really good one.
Sure.
Really
yeah, no, that's
one.
awesome. Yeah, for sure. Yeah. I mean, I think you probably, finding your wife, you absolutely have to say that has been the most positive change in your life,
Well,
right?
it really has.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I would hope so. So I really want to dig into Levenhall and what you guys are doing there. But before that, I know you've had a past life before Levenhall in, intelligence agencies. You were, in the military in Australia. And I don't know how much of that you can dig into. Can you just give us a brief kind of background, take us from, starting out in the military, how you worked your, way through there, and then how you got into intelligence in Australia? Is that however much you can share with us would be really awesome.
Sure. Look, so I started off straight out of the university, actually straight out of high school, joined the military, went to the Australian version of West Point, which is called the Australian Army, which enrolled at college at Trodden. I then did pilot's course and became a helicopter pilot. Flew Huey gunships, which is something out of the 70s. It was a magic aircraft to fly. It was like flying a Harley Davidson, a really terrific aircraft.
That's awesome.
But it was designed before ergonomics was a word. So it really still got back issues from that. But anyways, I transitioned from flying into the Army Intelligence Corps, where I was an intelligence officer. There, initially working in aviation intelligence and air intelligence. So I did Air Force training, I did Army training, and then found myself posted to the Defence Intelligence Organisation in Canberra, where I was doing counterintelligence planning initially for the war in Iraq in 2003. So winding you back a bit. At that point, I actually did a deployment to Iraq early on. That was a bit of a short one, but got over there nonetheless. And then I transitioned to the national security community in Australia, where I was focused initially on military and support to the military. And so I went back to Iraq, this time instead of in uniform, I went in khakis and contractor rig. So I had postings initially was doing that work and then into Thailand. So I had a long posting in Thailand. I was posted to the embassy there. I did a lot of work on countering people smuggling and countering terrorism issues in Thailand, working with the Thai agencies that are also working on that issue. I speak Thai. I went to Chiang Mai University for a year to learn that, which was fun. I then finished doing that, went back to Canberra, spent some time in our headquarters working on a number of issues, both sort of geographic and thematic, and then went on a posting to Afghanistan. So I spent a year in Afghanistan working alongside our special forces and acting as what they call a political military liaison officer or advisor. And so that involved a lot of working with the local leadership, the Afghan leadership in Tarankat in Uruzgan province, which is sort of in the southern part of Afghanistan. So I spent I spent 6 months doing that, and then I moved up to Kabul for the last 6 months and sort of lifted it up to the sort of federal level, engaging with the Afghans there. Got back from that, once again, a bit of a stint in headquarters, and then moved to all through this, traveling, to and fro around the world, having a lot of fun. And then I got a posting to Dubai. And as I mentioned at the start, was running our Office of Regional Affairs. I had a more senior officer there with me who was the regional coordinator, who was the sort of upward focused fellow. I was sort of more downwardly focused, sort of organising the sort of day-to-day operational activity around the place, and coordinating our efforts across a fairly large amount of countries. And Australia's Australia is what you'd call a regional power or a middle power. So we don't. It gives us an interesting perspective on the world. So our foreign policy tends to be to observe rather than to act. So we do a lot of work on the surface, which is observational work, but that actually gives us some unique insights into places where our bigger and bolder allies, such as the US, can't go, right? Because we're not perceived to have an agenda, and of course we don't, because our policies are set that way. So that gives us some pretty unique insight. But what it does mean, though, is because we're small and when we're pushing out far, into the Middle East, we're very broad and very thin. So our ability to actually, get depth in what we're doing is limited. Anyway, so that's it. Then I met a girl, and that's all she wrote.
Right, absolutely. I noticed you mentioned in some of the bio info that you sent over that you were a director and brand head or branch head responsible for cyber and counter proliferation issues. Can you dive into? I'm just curious about. I feel like in my mind, cyber issues could go lots of different directions. Can you speak to what you guys were doing or what you were doing, regarding that particular assignment or dispatch?
Yeah. So I ran a group of capabilities. So once again, very different kind of metric to in the US, where you've got, fairly large organizations addressing single issues. In Australia, we tend to have we have a much smaller organization, and so you get to do a lot more broad issue management, but at a lesser level, right? So I was fortunate enough to be in charge of a number of really interesting programs, one of which was concurrently, actually, one of which was our cyber program. And so that was, essentially looking at the aspects of cyber security and cyber defense, such that they relate to Australia. So, utilizing defensive measures to prevent, cyber attacks and cyber, interference in Australia, but also looking at ways that we can utilize our own skills to turn the tables.
That's awesome. So I also, you've mentioned a little bit in the cybersecurity piece. You obviously, we mentioned in the beginning about what Levenhall does and, the national security and related technology. And you obviously have several postings across the world. I'm a little bit curious of, how the landscape of technology has evolved since, your time over the last few decades to, kind of what you see coming now and where we're going in the future.
Well, that's a really interesting question. It's quite broad, because in some ways technology has improved markedly, but also in other ways, changes in technology have reduced our ability to use the technology. And I'll explain that, right? So early on, when I first deployed to Iraq, for instance, I was able to take with me a classified computer. I was able to set it up, and I was able to use a mobile phone to provide a data link back to our headquarters and then operate remotely. That was all done over a 2G system, and it was clunky as hell, and it was pretty much just text, but it worked. And I was able to travel, to quite a few places just carrying a big Pelican case. With the advent of, as the generational change happened through the telecommunications system, and then, voice and data over IP became more powerful, it basically, it meant that you couldn't put the security bubble around those telecommunications or that data communication that you could under a simpler system, right? It became much more complex. And so our ability to be remote and to be able to undertake communications or provide communications, both written and verbal, back to the center back to Canberra became much more difficult. And so we stopped doing it to a degree, or at least we had less flexibility than what we had before. On the other hand, of course, there's been some tremendous leaps forward in the ways we can communicate outwardly, the security around what we're doing, and the power of the compute that we can have in the field. So I'd say the biggest transition has been, from that regard, has been that previously everything was done in the headquarters, and this is true across all agencies, and all countries, to be honest, who use computing and data analytics and increasingly artificial intelligence. It necessarily started off in the headquarters or in a building in a safe place in the home country. And the size of those things was enormous. Basements full of, whirring machines. And, increasingly, because of the amount of data you're pushing through the internet and pushing through satellite bearers and other bearers, it's become increasingly difficult to, push that data out. And so the thinking very much has become, we have to do as much technology on the edge as we can across a whole range of domains. We have to be able to do it in the field, and we have to be able to do it in a way that doesn't rely on communications bearers, which have high latency and bandwidth issues. So edge computing has become incredibly important, and that is layered with the advent of artificial intelligence and the uptake of artificial intelligence and machine learning technologies that are really giving massive increases in understanding, network analysis, threat analysis, a whole bunch of really cool applications for national security. But they need the horsepower to do it, and they need the horsepower in the field. And I'd say we're right on the cusp of that, pushing that out. There's been another interesting change, and that relates to the story I told you before, which is, and it's been brought to light by the pandemic that we're currently in, which is because of the security measures required for running classified systems, you need to be in a secure environment. So that's called a SCIF, secure compartmented information facility, and it essentially is a super secure place. The problem with being tied or tethered to a SCIF or to a super secure environment is that you're all in one room all together, and you have to actually go there. And in an environment where you can no longer go to work, that becomes a challenge. And the national security apparatus and intelligence communities across the world have been caught in a I guess a conflict, internal conflict. Do they push people into work and make them take the risk in the pandemic environment, or do they keep them at home and stagger it and reduce the capabilities and abilities of the national security apparatus to do their job? It's a really, really tough choice, and agencies have approached it in different ways across different countries. But what that has said, and there's an increasing movement, especially in the US, on this, is how do we untether from the SCIF? How do we make it so that we can work remotely in the field in a way that is secure, that has the horsepower we need, that that lets us work from home, for instance, or work in a remote area, or when we're locked down in quarantine because we've had to travel to a country, from a country. So that's that move to be more agile and untethered from the SCIF is a really big, important issue that is currently occupying a lot of thought at the moment.
Yeah. There's like three different questions I feel like I could go with. And I think I'm gonna pull out a page out of Brad's playbook and ask a really short question after a really long preamble. But You mentioned the as technology has developed, it's both enabled as well as hindered the intelligence agencies and security agencies' ability to function. With that as technology gets better, people's ability and their access to types of technology to hinder or thwart the efforts and capabilities of security and intelligence groups' ability to monitor them. Right. That if I understand you right, that's kind of what you were driving at with that, right? I think a lot of my and Brad will tell you I have lots of foil hats, and I have I have lots of weird random things that I think about. I think there's a perception, and I'd love to, and I by no means I'm not asking this question out of a political ilk, but I think a lot of people have this perception, and I think Hollywood helps with it, that these security agencies have these abilities to tap into anything and everything in your, like they could, if they wanted to, they could watch me cooking dinner by tapping into my, my TV and all this other stuff. And, a lot of people are concerned about some of those things. And I don't want to talk to the concern, because the concern is what it is. I'm curious from your perception, if technology is advancing and people are more aware of that, how does that affect intelligence agencies' ability to collect information, and how I know you can't get into the weeds in terms of how they're pivoting around that, but is that some of what's driving the innovation in the intelligence community, as people are more aware of what their capabilities are, that they're having to try to stay ahead of that curve, or is the innovation going in a different direction?
It's a complex question. Innovation in the intelligence space is being driven by essentially a competition, I would say, more than anything. So there are a number. I've got to unpack that question a little bit, because there's a lot. Sure.
Yeah. It's loaded. I get it.
There's a whole bunch of reasons to innovate. One is to increase the capability of what you're doing against your adversaries. There's the questions that get asked of the national intelligence community and the intelligence communities everywhere are, set by government. It's what the government wants to know, and the intelligence community has to solve the problem of how they answer those questions. And they have to answer those questions in as fulsome manner as possible, to try to undo the ambiguity that goes with the nature of those questions. And so the innovation around intelligence is driven by a desire to provide clarity. That's the main desire. There is a counter narrative, a counter aspect to this, which is our adversaries are doing the same thing to us. And every country has a legitimate reason, a legitimate requirement to understand what is happening with friends and foe alike. It's just how the world works in reality. And so our adversaries are doing that to us. So there is a race to be able to defend against that. So that's on the capability. Pure intelligence doesn't take into consideration the individual rights of people who are in the community. That part of the question, that political aspect and the human rights aspect and privacy considerations are a challenge, and they're obviously subject to interpretation. But I would say that in my experience, I have never seen malintent with that, and there are structures in place across communities, especially in the Western countries, independent structures which act as the methods for scrutiny on how technology is applied within the law. And so, to answer that part of the question, the intelligence communities are not, specifically trying to find out what you had for breakfast. Even though they probably could.
It'd be very boring to find out.
Even though they probably could. That's not what they're trying to do. And there are a bunch of legislative restrictions preventing them from doing that. especially to their own citizens, without good cause. But the other part to it is trying to get back to the what's driving it. There is a genuine fear that we will be left behind, and that our life is online now. Increasingly, everyone will be online, and increasingly there is going to be a digital life, which allows you to get inside the way people think and inside the way they act, and what might indicate if they're going to make bad decisions or decisions that are going to impact national security. So that there's a with the greater ability to get that understanding, there's a greater desire to want to get it, if that makes sense.
Right. Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense. And for me, it's there's from what I hear you saying, there's also that balance of understanding, security and safety, and, to your point, making sure that we're monitoring the right things to keep, at the end of the day, the security agencies and intelligence agencies, they're all about protecting us. Right. And from foe, whether that's, domestic or international. Yeah,
that's right. And I would say that the ethics of national security are at the forefront of everyone's mind. And you seldom undertake any kind of planning or activity without legal advice, without some sort of oversight. In fact, never. I would say never anymore. Maybe in the past, back in the bad old days, but not anymore.
Yeah.
Well, Adam, correct if I'm wrong, but we've touched on a lot of things. There's a lot of data and analytics being used. There's a lot of that processing of data. So. To the folks, and Drew, to put one of your tinfoil hats away, like the people, yes, they probably could have the opportunity to see what I could eat for breakfast, but there's how many people across, the globe, right?
Yeah,
where
for sure.
In honesty, in my opinion, at least, if they're looking into you, they probably feel like they have a pretty legitimate legal reason to look into you. Like if you're, a normal human being just living your life, I don't feel like they really care that much about digging in and tapping in there, especially inwardly in the United States. So correct me if I'm wrong there, but that's kind of my impression of there's just so much information to filter through. They don't.
It's a little bit more complex than that, right? So, individuals have a right to privacy, and that's enshrined in legislation in my country and in the US. So, and people should feel entitled to have that privacy and to do their, go about their lives unmolested and feeling like they're able to, to do their normal day-to-day life without someone looking over their shoulder. And that's a really important thing.
Absolutely.
For democracy and for freedom, the freedoms that we have, right?
Yeah.
You absolutely can, with the technology that is around at the moment, bulk data analysis, large data techniques, the ability to store massive amounts of data, and even people that are storing data and have been storing data for quite some time, even without the ability to analyze it in case they want to retrospectively analyze it once they get the technology to allow them to do it. That is absolutely achievable right here, right now. And so really the approach really needs to be surgical, and it needs to be driven by legitimate government requirements. And I think that, and then overlaid with an oversight process, which exists. That's not to say there's not errors along the way. Of course there are, because at the end of the day, we're all human. But as I mentioned before, in my experience, no one has the intent to break the rules.
Right. So you mentioned this concept of the skiff and having to be in that ultra secure area, and COVID potentially driving I'm assuming that this wasn't a novel concept prior to COVID, but maybe COVID's accelerated this idea of how do you take that skiff-like environment out, and distribute it into multiple areas so that you don't have to have this consolidation of manpower and resource. And you mentioned edge computing playing a role or maybe the driving force in that. I'm curious, and this is a question that we ask everybody that comes on the show. From your perspective, how do you conceptualize the edge? What does that mean to you? And how do you see the edge playing a role in that type of adaptation in the security intelligence space?
So the edge in my mind is essentially it starts large. It's almost like a layered, in my mind, a layered thing, right? So as you're moving out from really dense, large scale computing in the middle, and then pushing out to say an edge data center. Maybe there's something that's in an embassy or in a forward operating base or in headquarters in the field. Pushing even further out to the individual warfighter or intelligence operator on the ground, the technology that they've got in their hand, like a phone or mobile phones are incredibly powerful computing devices. And all of those things, when intermeshed from the tactical to the sort of mid-level to the more strategic computing powers are all part of the system. So the edge, I think, is anything beyond the center, and it becomes, more and more granular the further you go out, I think.
Yeah, and to follow up on that, how do you? I think that's a brilliant conceptualization of the anything beyond the center, and I'm gonna write that down and use it because I like that. What do you see as capable? I mean, the edge technology, the data center technology, the mobile technology is constantly evolving, and both, to your point, literally the mobile technology, our phones, those cellular devices, as well as mobile compute technology is evolving, and it seems as though we're in this exponential, like at the very base of a very strong exponential curve in terms of the technology that's being developed and coming. What do you think is possible from, to your point, an FOB standpoint or an individual operator? Like where do you think that the tech really, like how crazy can we get, in terms of what's realistic? Like, I mean, there, Tom Clancy novels and all this crazy stuff, right? There's stuff out there in terms of, what people think could happen, but what's realistically, what are we looking at from what could be developed with the technology in the next 10 to 15 years?
Look, I think this is a really cool question because I love this stuff. I think I love conceptualizing about how far we can take science and technology in the field, but the ultimate, I think the ultimate manifestation of it in the national security space is total situational awareness. So, as an individual, I can understand the people that I'm seeing. I can look at them, I can get a readout on their background, whether they're going to have bad intentions or good intentions. I can look at potentially the electromagnetic spectrum to see what environment I'm in from that perspective. I understand, what aircraft are above me, what, other things might be monitoring me, like I said, total situational awareness. That from a warfighter perspective and from an intelligence operator's perspective is critical for safety, but it also, it's critical for accuracy in what you're doing. So from a warfighter perspective, for instance, ensuring that, if you're in a battle, that you can avoid civilian casualties, or if you're in a unconventional situation, that you're not accidentally killing the wrong person. That's important stuff, right? Or more importantly, that's not more important. Alternatively, that if you are targeting someone, that you're, really sure that it's the person that needs to be targeted. And along those lines, providing you alternatives to how you deal with it. So understanding people's networks, how you can influence them, if you can imagine this, this is a real flight of fancy, but I've got to say it's not too far off. Walking down a street, having the ability to look at a person, and this is terrifying. And I'm sure for from a civil rights perspective, it's
your tinfoil hat at, Drew.
Yeah, right. But you look at somebody, and with visual recognition, you tap into their social media profile and profiles, any of their online presence. You can pick up from their phone and their watch and whatever else they're wearing, the type of technology that they've got access to. You can get a pretty quick indication of who their network of friends are, the types of things they like, what they've got, what information they might know that could be of use, that kind of thing. And that could all be projected onto your eyeball.
Yeah, so it's really interesting that you bring that up, because and we'll take a left turn here and we'll make it back on the main course here. But I don't know if you've ever watched the series. I think it was a BBC series, and then Netflix picked it up, Black Mirror.
Yes.
So I don't remember which season it was, but there was an episode where essentially everybody. There was a technology and a system by which they garnered all of that information about your social, your credit score, your buying history, all this stuff. And you got a rating. Based on, and you could only associate with people that had a similar rating to you. Right. So it's interesting that you bring that up, because it's obviously, it's not something that's novel or that people aren't conceptualizing.
They did that on Community too. I saw that episode the other day.
Oh, did they really?
A comedy version of it.
Nice. But
it's really challenging. Like, the ethics of that is really challenging, really challenging. And I think that's something the governments are grappling with. It's certainly beyond my pay grade, but
for sure.
To say that capability is, it's within our.
Yeah, it is, and it is, but there's I have to imagine there's a massive amount of continuous compute that would have to go on for you to be able to have, right? Because a lot of what we talk about is, there's the compute, but then there's the the transit of that compute, right? So for you to be able to be walking down the street and pass me and see my social profile and my credit scores, and do I have a criminal record and all of that stuff, for you to be able to get that in real time, there's got to be a massive compute and communication,
huge amount of data transmission, as well as a huge database to access. I mean, a huge amount of information to go through very, very quickly. And you need some seriously high powered computers to do that. Yeah, for sure. Right, and even, TMG is definitely, on the pathway to enabling that kind of technology.
Right.
But it's and as we bump into quantum computing, where it's there's going to be orders of magnitude in processing speed achievable. That'll be a massive step as well.
I want to ask one more tinfoil hat question, and then I'll pass the buck. But AI and machine learning and all these things are obviously, I mean, they're buzzwords, but they're real things, right? The proliferation of artificial intelligence and machine learning and all of those things are it's real, and it's here. And I'm just to kind of piggyback off of that example we were just talking about. I think there's a potential for AI to have a real impact in some of that type of, maybe it's not real time awareness and those kinds of things legitimately, in a walking down the street scenario. But I have to imagine that at some point, if it may already be happening, I'm just not aware of it, but that artificial intelligence and machine learning, that it's being used to, to assess threats, whether that's, threats and risk, and saying, okay, well, we have these factors and we've got algorithms, and based on past things and factors that, that affect those factors, this is what we think the potential risk threat is. And this is where we feel like the risk is. And because to your point, we only have a finite amount of resources. So part of that game is allocating your resources in the right place. right? And I'm curious if you can speak to how that's being done, or how the technology that's being advanced is just going to increase that capability.
Yeah, I'll give you a real example, and it's one of our clients is an AI company that centers around some very interesting science around the voice and the way the voice can contain information, and not because of modulation or because of what you say, but just the inherent physical way that the voice box forms words, regardless of culture and regardless of language, that is common to all humans, right? So the science has come. There's a lot of work being done at Carnegie Mellon around the research and development. One of our clients has a technology which allows, through a Siri kind of interface, so an automated voice, it can ask between 5 and 10 yes or no questions, and with a 98% accuracy rate, can give you an indication of risk. So, call that truthfulness, or call that deception, or whatever. So that's a really powerful technology, and then that is near real time. So you can get the answers to that very, very quickly. Where they're using that very cleverly is in assessing insider threat, in particular in war zones, where there have been a number of what they call green on blue incidences, where partner forces have been infiltrated by terrorist groups, say in Afghanistan, and they might have been infiltrated by the Taliban, and they nestled themselves inside a partner force, and then use that as an opportunity to kill US and Australian soldiers, and that's a well-known series of incidents that have happened over many years. So this technology is being used to determine if any of the partner forces have got affiliations with threat groups, terrorist groups, Taliban, etc. So that's a really specific and very positive defensive use of that technology. In a more commercial sense, they're using it for people who are undertaking fraudulent activity, for HR selection processes. And the way they're using it is not to say no and say this is a bad thing, but essentially it's to hone in HR people and insurance inspectors and investigators to hone in on where they should look deeper. But the technology is incredibly powerful. It's AI backed. It resides in the cloud.
Yeah, I'm curious. So, not knowing much about the technology, I'm curious. Is it something? So, I have a background in mental health. Is the technology such that it could be leveraged in terms of like
resiliency,
like on yep. resiliency or crisis hotlines and those kinds of things to give some sort of a risk assessment on, if somebody calls into a crisis hotline, like a suicide hotline or something like that, to use the technology to determine a level of risk for that individual to harm themselves or not?
Look, I'd say, it probably could, but I would say a better utilization of it, or a better way to use that kind of technology would be, for instance, in the veteran community, where veterans are taught to be tough and to hide their emotions and really sort of squirrel it all inside, which then ultimately has negative results. And, the veteran community has huge rates of PTSD and suicide. So as part of a welfare check, putting someone through that technology on a welfare check to determine whether they are kidding themselves, firstly, whether they're feeling good or whether they're actively lying about it, because they don't want to, they don't want to tell people that they've got a weakness or that they're feeling bad. So yeah, from a mental health resiliency perspective, really strong applications. There's other applications too for law enforcement, for instance, where currently there's no accurate and quick way of determining if someone has been taking drugs, apart from doing a blood test, right, which you have to go back to the station for. They've got the alcohol test, which you can do, by speaking. Well, in this situation, you can just ask someone, have you been taking drugs?
That's fascinating.
Yeah. So So there's a whole bunch of really interesting applications of that kind of technology. So yes, the answer to your question earlier on, Matt, that there are a lot of real life right here, right now applications for AI and machine learning that are going to change the way we think about things across the board.
Oh, that has my mind spinning on a lot of the possibilities. I can see why now you sit there and go, where can it go, and why you get so excited about it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because now, like, I don't have anywhere close to any of the experience that you have, and I'm already going, man, this is cool. This is cool. That could be happening. That could be happening. And I have kind of a two-parted question that you somewhat touched on, of the different applications. And we all know that there's different government agencies, but when people start thinking of the government, they typically like to go 3-letter agencies, or even the military and wartime. And obviously there's plenty of need for technology innovation in those communities, but there's also the healthcare aspects of it, or the utility aspect of it, or the veteran affairs side, which we topped into just a little bit. From those different broader groups, are you seeing kind of an equal push for innovation, or is it being led by the 3-letter agencies in the government? That's the first kind of part of my question, and so I'll let you answer that. I have a second part.
Okay. The answer is that the commercial sector is the driving force for the innovation, and I would say that's one of the things that has changed over the years. I mean, very much it was the case previously that, especially in the US, where the big research institutions within the DoD in particular were driving innovation from a federal government perspective, and the commercial space was kind of lagging behind. But I would say probably for the last 20 years, and that's a wild ass guess, but for the last 20 years, the commercial sector has accelerated its innovation speed beyond what the government can achieve. And that's for a bunch of reasons, not through lack of demand or intent, but just because the government is constrained by bureaucracy, some of it necessary. For instance, the government has to invest the taxpayers' money. And so there is an oversight process which makes sure that they are actually doing that in a meaningful and well-considered manner. The commercial sector is driven by different motivations. It's driven by profit. It's driven by, in some cases, goodwill and a desire to change things, but not constrained by having to go back and seek approval to do it. They just crack on and get on with it. So I would say that the driver of innovation currently is in the commercial sector. And part of what I'm doing is trying to grab that tiger by the tail, I guess, and say, look, the commercial innovation needs to, it needs to be pulled into the government and national security sector, because it really is outstripping it by quite a significant way. And we've got to find a way to drive through the bureaucracy and the procurement problems and acquisition problems or challenges, I guess is probably a better way to describe it, that the government has, especially in the national security space. And my intention is to create a list of technologies, or like a shopping list of technologies, maybe a marketplace of national security focused technology that the national security agencies, the 3-letter agencies, can come and look at and say, we want that. That's really cool. We can use that, and let them sort out their procurement problems, but have that technology shaped in the best way such that it actually is an easy transition. Because there's a lot of things to consider about working in for an intelligence community agency, right? It's there's different considerations about security around the technology, about supply chain, about the people that are involved in it, about its ability to access, the open source cloud, for instance. There's things that you need to prepare for to engage the intelligence community. And the other thing is that some technologies have national security application, but don't know it. And so they sometimes need a bit of help understanding that, if they were willing to apply their technology in a particular manner, that it could be of great utility. So it's that joining up piece. So that's what I do right here, right now.
Awesome. Yeah. And that helps answer, or at least helps me form an opinion. I'll ask my second part of the question is obviously the commercial side, to your point, is driving it. And you're trying to create that marketplace to help match them. And then you mentioned a little bit of the bureaucracy. When you work with different agencies and different sections of the government, there's a perception, mainly led by, a lot of the books that are out there, a lot of television shows, movies and stuff, that a lot of those interagencies don't like to work together. Or they do when they have to. But from a technology adoption perspective, I know they probably all have their own individual components and focuses to meet their specific needs. But when it comes to matching up technologies, do you see that, they typically like to share resources, or do they kind of like to stay within their own little bucket and do what they need to do and, reluctantly share if they absolutely have to?
Yeah, there's an interesting challenge in the US in particular, and I'll focus on the US to start with, and I'll offer you a comparison to some of the smaller countries out there. The US is enormous. It is the Department of Defense, for instance, has the Marine Corps, which is the smallest branch of the military in the US, is bigger than the entire Australian Defence Force. So there's an order of magnitude of scale which comes with its own bureaucracy and its own stovepipes in particular. And so there has been procurement systems developed by branch and by unit and by command that don't necessarily communicate with other parts, even within their own branch, right? But there is definitely a desire and an acknowledgement that that's the case. And there are some pretty important organizations out there. So on the defense side, you've got the Pentagon working through some agencies like the Defense Innovation Unit, as well as the National Security Innovation Network, who are trying to pull together all the disparate threads within DoD. And on the intelligence side, you've got Incutel, which is based in Silicon Valley, which is the intelligence community's interface really with the commercial world. And they represent the intelligence community as a whole and act as a center point. On top of that, you've got the Director of National Intelligence sitting above all of the intelligence agencies with an innovation unit, which is once again trying hard to ensure that there is efficiencies and optimization of those pathways, right? An enormous challenge in such a huge environment. Conversely, in a very small environment like in Australia, where we don't have as many people, we don't have as many resources as well, there is still that problem. There is still a stovepiping issue. And there are once again efforts underway, especially in defence, to try to tighten that up. So Australia's created its own Defence Innovation Unit, for instance, which is emulating the one in the US. Incutel has moved out to Australia in order to help the Office of National Intelligence there, construct and build their own, IC innovation system, and Levenhall's playing a role in that too. And we're working to develop a early stage national security investment fund, venture fund, which will focus on pushing companies from early stage in Australia, investing in them and pushing them into the national security environment, or at least making them aware of it and shaping them for it. But to broaden the scope a little bit, the US has a lot of allies, and some of them closer than others. In the intelligence world, there's a fairly old alliance called the Five Eyes Alliance, which is Australia, New Zealand, Canada, the UK, and the US. And that is an intelligence sharing alliance, which came out of the Second World War effectively. And it's long-standing, and it covers all of the ICs. In the defence domain, there's from Australian perspective, there's a treaty called ANZUS, which is the Australian, New Zealand, US treaty. There's NATO. There's individual bilateral treaties. the level of technology sharing, even within the tightest of the intelligence communities, the Five Eyes, is pretty poor. It's, in some aspects of intelligence, especially the SIGINT agencies, which is the signals intelligence agencies, the sharing is very good. But on the human intelligence side, not so much. And there's a whole bunch of reasons for that, historical and practical, and but there's also some not very good reasons for it too, which can be overcome. So, so one of the things Levenhall is trying to do is to help resolve that alliance sharing of technology and awareness of technology. And for instance, there's going to be technology in the US that's relevant to Australia. We already know that because that's pretty much how it works already. But there is definitely technology in Australia that's going to be relevant to the US, might be relevant to Canada, might be relevant to the UK, might be relevant to Japan. There's a general, we have a desire to improve the mobility and the agility of national security related technology across alliances.
So I'm curious, I mean, you obviously hit on as a whole what you guys at Levenhall are doing. I'm curious how, I know this, I'd love for you to speak to. I think I know this based on what you've already said, but like what made you, you were, I know you said you were in Dubai, you got, you met your wife, got married, but what was the impetus for starting Levenhall in terms of, what made you think, man, there's a lot of great tech out there and I want to try to connect, international intelligence communities with technology? What was the motivation behind starting Levenhall?
Well, so I mean, the partners, the four of us who are the partners in Levenhall are all former national security professionals and pretty recent. And it was really as simple as seeing technology and saying, "Hey, that is excellent technology, and we don't have in our old jobs, we didn't have access to it, and it would have made us much more capable and able to serve our governments if we had been able to have that technology." And so we started trying to find ways to get it there. And there's as novices really, with long careers in the government, you don't get exposed to the commercial side very often. So we had assumed it was pretty easy, right? We were assuming, surely there's a way to do this. It's surely the paths are well trodden. But as we started investigating, it became apparent that it was actually quite complex. And there's, at the heart of it really is a translation issue, is a lexicon. The national security apparatus speaks a language that is quite different to the technology world. And trying to match those two languages together and help the technology companies interpret a solicitation from SOCOM. What is SOCOM for starters? Special Operations Command. What does all these little acronyms mean? What are the three-letter acronyms? TLAs. What are all of them? And it's full of them. Similarly, the national security apparatus has a very poor understanding of how a company works, what phase they're in of investment, whether they've had seed, whether they've got a minimum viable product, whether they're ready to go to market, what their go-to-market strategy is. All of those things are an anathema to the national security, and nor do they care really. They just want their thing. So what we realized is that we all wanted to serve. We wanted to continue to serve. None of us left because necessarily we wanted to. We all made life choices, family choices, important ones that obviously we stand by. But we did want to still do our bit, and you don't join that environment because you want to make lots of money and there's a little bit of wanting to see the world, but mostly you want to be part of something and part of do something for society. And it sounds a bit trite to say, but it's true. And so we all basically said, okay, well, we want to do this. We want to continue to serve by helping make our national security apparatus more capable. And so then we started mapping. We started working with companies to find the pathways, and then tailoring those pathways for the specific company. And we found that, some of our skill sets made us able to do that, so especially military planning. There's a lot of commonality between military planning process and some of the skills involved in business development and marketing. Early on in the piece, we started working with some Australian and UK companies, and we realised, real quick that the US actually, for all its challenges, is probably 10 years ahead of the UK, which in itself is probably 10 years ahead of Australia and Canada and New Zealand. And so we said, well, we need to understand how the systems work there as well, because that's fundamental to our vision. And as an Australian, it's the alliance is probably more important to us than it is to the US. We rely heavily on it, and we want to contribute to it, and we want to be part of it. We want to do our bit, and so there's a real desire to sort of have us, make it work. And so that led us to our next phase. Actually, is we sort of looked at the outside of the US and said, okay, how can we take the best bits of the US and design an innovation ecosystem that answers the problems for the US's closest allies? And so we started designing different pieces of an ecosystem that start at the R&D phase in universities, where there's a whole bunch of really, really good ideas and there's some very, very smart people doing some excellent research, but they can't get it out. They can't find the pathway, and very few of them are focused on answering a national security challenge. And then there's the next phase, which is the one we're doing first, which is the acceleration phase. How do you get that early stage company to make it viable and have a product that works? And then, which is concurrently aware of the national security environment. And then beyond that is, how do you then grow that company? How do you make it commercially viable to hedge against procurement uncertainty? It has to be commercially successful. And that's where this concept of dual use technology comes in, where there needs to be a commercial application. So our focus is definitely not things that go bang and, true military hardware. That's not the space we're looking at. We're looking at the more, I guess, refined technology that comes around intelligence and national security work, and the architecture that supports it.
Gotcha. That makes sense. That's really cool. And I think it's super cool that you guys found a way to continue to serve in your space, and really, the way I see it, and I don't know if this is accurate, correct me if I'm wrong, but you guys are almost, you're serving not in a better way, but just in an enabling way, right? You're trying to help the guys and gals that are doing what they're doing, do it better, more effectively, safer. And I think that's really, really cool.
We see ourselves representing, on one hand, the warfighter and the intelligence operator at the tactical level.
Yeah.
And on the other hand, the technology company, out in the real world. And our mission is to try to join the two together.
Yeah.
In the most expeditious way possible.
Right.
That sounds easy.
Well, that's my next question. What's been your biggest challenge? Obviously, I think the easy answer is the bureaucracy, right? Because to your point, the system, the internal systems that you're dealing with have their bureaucracy, and the technology development organizations have their hurdles of development and all of those things. But what do you feel like has been the single largest barrier to that connection?
I think there's, depending on the stage, so I'll address each side. On the commercial side, companies, especially at an early stage, have a bandwidth issue. They're focusing on their core business, on becoming successful, making a profit, making sure they don't collapse. There's a pretty high failure rate in startups, and so they don't have a lot of time, both so human resource time or intellectual time, to devote to addressing a BD problem effectively. So that's one thing which we're trying to solve for them. So that it's convincing a board of a company that yes, you do, it is worth your while to allocate some resources to Levenhall to help you get into this space. It is a big market, and I'll give you some examples, some numbers. So in the intelligence community, a few years ago, across the Five Eyes Alliance, the overall size of the market was $62 billion, which is a pretty big amount. Of that 62 billion, 55 billion was the US. 3 billion about was the UK, 1.5 billion each for Australia and Canada, and then sort of in the hundreds of thousands for New Zealand. So, it's a high order of magnitude for the US. That makes the US market a compelling market choice. And within that, that's an annual budget, 65 billion. So it's not small, not inconsequential. So there is a real potential for accessing that funds. And there have been a number of unicorns that have been achieved through focusing on the federal market. On the government side, you nailed it on the head straight away. Bureaucracy, it's a killer. Generally speaking, there is a disconnect between the operator and the warfighter from the procurement people, and that's just mostly a nature of geography and people's skill sets and what have you. But if you go and talk to a special forces operator about what he wants or she wants in the field, compared to what the procurement officers are saying that they need through official solicitations or broad agency announcements, that kind of thing, they can be quite different. And so it's sort of trying to navigate it's trying to get to the heart of what we actually need. What are the things we need to do our jobs? Yeah.
That's awesome. So thank you for that. This is super fascinating. I'm going to shift gears a little bit, and I'd be a little remiss if I didn't stir the pot and scare Drew a little bit with some tinfoil hat stuff. So as we all know, there's an executive order that came out for virtual substations, and there's all sorts of different articles out there depending on what you want to believe that the next potential massive attack could be more of a technology EMP attack of things. And so I kind of wanted to get, because of your experience and your opinion, and slightly to have some giggles at Drew's expense. What do you think is the validity of that? What are some of the actual potentials versus what are some of the defenses that you've talked about? Some of the sharing that we've already touched on is it real? Is it not real? Kind of where we sit with some of those things.
I'll respond to that in generalities, I think, for the most part. But think of it this way: a nation state will undertake a planning process, both for a clear and present threat, as well as in a contingency perspective, to defeat any perceived adversary, right? And so what they'll do is they'll undertake a mission planning process at the strategic level, which will look at a society and say, how can we defeat it? And critical infrastructure and the ability for people to communicate, to have power, to be able to to travel, to have their logistics work. They're all key parts of it, right? So there are efforts across a number of nations to ensure that if it ever came down to it, that they would be able to disable aspects of critical infrastructure. And then that's just because that's good military planning. And in the military, the mindset is, well, if you're going to plan for it, you might as well get ready for it. So, of course, they start working out how to do that, and then they develop the weapons to enable them to do it. Now, what state those weapons are in at any given time, I'm not sure. I don't know. But I know that that is something that is critical. So in response to that, a really important thing to defend against that, even if it's a perceived threat, is to consider business continuity and business resilience. and business resumption. And so having the ability to be prepared to shift your command centers, for instance, or shift your banking institutions information to somewhere which is isolated from that kind of attack is something that should be being considered, and it's a critical part of national defence, I think. Yeah. Does that answer the question?
No, it does, and I know that you have to speak in generalities because of what you do. And, I always like to poke fun at Drew's tinfoil hat, but, it makes sense, obviously, from a military planning perspective, but the business continuity piece, obviously, Drew and I have more of a technology data center background. It's what typical businesses are doing, right. Not to the scale of, necessarily true outside attacks, except for maybe, a competitor in a cybersecurity hack or just bad actors in general. But that makes perfect sense. And it does answer the question. And, obviously think, go ahead.
It has much broader utility. That's the reason to do it, really. It's not because you think, China's going to drop an EMP and wipe out the power grid. It's because there's things like hurricanes and earthquakes and tornadoes that, you need to ensure that, that society continues to operate and that you can go to the bank and get your money out, or, use the telephone to call for an ambulance. All of those things need to continue regardless. And so business resumption as a very broad brush national security posture is really important, and it has to be being considered.
So Adam, are there any things that you can think of? I mean, we've touched on a lot, and as we're kind of drawn to the end of our time, are there things that are of interest to you that you can talk about that we haven't addressed that you want to talk about before we head out?
One of the things that might be useful to think about is how we perceive capability gaps, and because that's a really interesting part of the problem, where it's actually it's a really important, essential element of they call it an EFI, essential element of friendly information. So it's a really important part of your own country's secret knowledge is what their gaps are, what they can't do, right? So they don't like to share, and it's really they don't like to tell anyone publicly what they can't do. So there's a real challenge in, that's why, if you ever look at the broad agency announcements of the kinds of things that they're looking for, they're really broad. Like they say, oh, we're interested in artificial intelligence technology or cybersecurity or whatever it is, but they don't go specifically into the detail or what it is they actually need. And there's a real, what that does is it creates a lot of noise, and it creates a lot of mismatching between what people perceive the problem to be and what the problem actually is. So we use a lens when we're looking at technologies inside Levenhall to determine with a bit more granularity what a capability gap might be and how a technology could fulfill it. And we use what's called the intelligence cycle, which is a standard military NATO, everyone in the world uses it, and it's how all intelligence agencies run. It's essentially a process where, someone gives direction to collect intelligence. The intelligence agency goes out and collects it. They bring it back, they analyze it, they put it into a report, and then they disseminate it. And because of that report that's been disseminated, more questions come up and the cycle continues. So that's the broad intelligence cycle. There's 5 components to it. It's really traditional. It's, it's kind of a little bit passé, and it's, there's some newer thinking around how intelligence processes work. But for us, it's a pretty neat way to say, okay, well, a technology that we're looking at might fit in, say, the collection space. And we understand that, there's a particular gap, mainly because we're recent and mainly because we've got some advisors around us who provide connectivity to the intelligence community. So we talk to those advisors and we say, would, technology X fulfill that particular collection gap at the moment? And they say yes or no. Similarly, for analysis, and analysis actually is probably a bigger challenge at the moment than any collection technology, where, because of the amount of data that can be consumed and sucked in, and the amount of horsepower needed to analyze that data, there's, it's a massive challenge for an intelligence agency to analyze all the things that they've got and not miss something critical. So, there's a whole bunch of technologies around that. And then underlying all of that stuff around the intelligence cycle is the infrastructure that supports all of it. And that's very much where TMGcore fits in. It fits in as a potentially critical enabling technology for a whole range of activities around the intelligence cycle.
Gotcha. No, I would have never thought about it from that state, but it makes sense in terms of you don't want to let your vulnerabilities be exposed. So I imagine that, when we were talking about hurdles to how you guys do what you do, you have to be very, what's the word I'm looking for? Very not political, but you have to be very gentle in how you go about pursuing needs and trying to connect needs, and as well as gathering information, right? Because you may not have all of the sensitivity of the information, so you're having to leverage, analysts or folks of that nature and how you go about making those connections. So that's a really interesting hurdle that I would have never have thought of. So that's
yeah, and look, our nations, organizations, potential adversaries out there, are actively trying to determine what those gaps are. And so it's really important that, that we remain cognizant of that, and that, that we apply, knowledge in a manner that, protects the overall, capability, I guess.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. Very cool. Well, so Adam, if our listeners are interested in connecting with you on social media or however else, just to understand what you guys are doing and connect with what you're doing at Levenhall, how can they go about finding you guys?
LinkedIn's probably the best way. So I've got a LinkedIn profile, which we can put in, I guess, in the underneath in the in the thing. We're not huge communicators on social media. It's not a thing we proactively work on. But yeah, we've got a website, levenhall.com. If you're interested, it's a work in progress. Currently going through a logo and redesign, which is pretty exciting. I like doing that stuff. But yeah, so levenhall.com. I'm on LinkedIn. We've got our own page on LinkedIn. We're not on Twitter or all the others. So.
Yeah, it makes sense that, given what you guys are doing, you don't need a massive social media campaign to get things accomplished. So,
currently, look, I'm not remaining stagnant on that. You never know, right? I've got a long history of not wanting to do that, so I've got to overcome my own personal, inner demons, I guess, inner restrictions, inner constraints, whatever.
No, that makes perfect sense. Well, Adam, I know I speak for all of us here, Drew and I, all of us at TMGcore. We truly appreciate your time, and we're extremely grateful that you joined us here. And obviously, we look forward to keeping up with you and talking soon, and just appreciate you coming on.
Yeah, no worries, guys. And back at you. I think what you guys are doing is really critical technology. It's a huge enabler for not only national security but a whole bunch of other edge computing and data center solutions. And happy to be working with you on pushing you into the right spaces.
Very cool. Very cool. Thanks, man. Well, that's going to do it for us here today on The Edge, a TMGcore production. Don't forget to subscribe anywhere you pick up your favorite podcast and leave us a 5-star review there. You can also find us at www.theedgetmgcore.com. So thanks so much. We'll catch you next time. And remember, the edge will go as far as you take it. So thanks, Adam. Appreciate it.
No worries.
All right. Take care, man. Hey guys, Drew here again. Thanks so much for checking out this episode of The Edge. Brad and I had a blast, and I hope that you enjoyed it as well. Now, if you haven't done so already, make sure you go and like, subscribe, and sign up for notifications on the channel so that you're always in the know in terms of content that we're dropping here on the channel. Also, don't forget to check out these really awesome videos here over to the side, somewhere around here, on stuff that's already on the channel. There's a lot of really cool things that we're posting on the regular, and so you're going to want to make sure that you come back on a regular basis and check out the content that's there. So from all of us here at TMGcore and The Edge, thanks so much, and we'll check you next time.